Good evening, everyone. This is really a journey into the nature of awakening, what awakening really means. Now, some of you will have heard some parts of this already, but it's good to hear it again. And this talk is also it's on YouTube, so later I can give you the link, so you can watch it. It was recorded in Singapore a few years ago, when I was first invited to the Buddhist fellowship in Singapore. And on this journey of awakening, the first thing that we have to realize is that our minds are a result of conditioning. Social conditioning and also, formal education, starting in elementary school or primary school. Because before I went to India and started to get some of these wonderful teachings, I had no idea that my mind was a result of conditioning. Had no idea. Because nobody had ever pointed it out to me. Not even once. So we're conditioned by the society, by education, by the media, by local beliefs, including the childhood fear of ghosts and spirits. We're also conditioned by the climate, by the food, by the culture that surrounds us. And of course, part of our conditioning is language. We can't avoid learning languages. Now, where I grew up, in the West Indies, in the other side of the world, on the island of Jamaica, I was conditioned with the belief in African ghosts and spirits. Just like you're conditioned here with Chinese ghosts and spirits. And I really believed them. And I imagined them, and I thought they were real. But only later I began to realize it was just the power of the imagination. So maybe later I can just mention why we believe in ghosts and spirits. Because most cultures believe in some kind of spirits, but there's a reason. There's a reason for this. Now, what the Buddha realized was that he realized the human conditioning, and why we have this thing called dukkha, mental, emotional suffering and conflict. And as you know, in essence, he was a very profound psychologist and a psychotherapist. And he saw that the people around him in the Hindu culture suffered a great deal from ignorance and delusion, from mental defilements. And out of that came a lot of fear, anxiety, superstitious beliefs. And that's why they had sacrifices. Not only animal sacrifice, but human sacrifice. So as you know, the path he took was very different. Because he was able to purify his mind of these mental defilements. And as human beings, we all have mental defilements because it's a part of our conditioning. Our minds are conditioned to react. Our brains are programmed, educated to label, judge, criticize, condemn, compare, to like or dislike, to want or not to want, or to have aversion and ill will. And aversion and ill will includes hatred, resentment, jealousy, disrespect, and so on. This is a conditioning of our mental defilements. So this is the cause of our conflicts, discontentment, disharmony, and dis-ease. The idea of a permanent, unchanging ego center or self is strengthened by this conditioning. And it is this deep-rooted illusion of a permanent, concrete, and separate ego entity which is the source and cause of our problems and conflicts, fears and worries, craving, greed, and attachments. So on the journey of awakening, it's important that we understand that we're conditioned beings and we have these mental defilements. And our main defilement is ignorance and delusion. And ignorance means that we have a strong attachment to believe that the self is something permanent and it is something separate. And the reason why this self feels separate is because of the conditioning of duality. So we'll speak about that, how the mind is conditioned with the idea of duality, meaning subject and object. And delusion is something which the mind is constantly being subjected to. But initially we don't realize that our minds are being deluded. And out of ignorance and delusion comes self-centered craving and attachment. Self-centered craving and clinging. And also aversion and ill will. resentment, jealousy, and so on. And we mentioned before that the qualities of the Buddha are wisdom and mindfulness, simplicity and renunciation, and loving kindness and compassion. And when we look at our mental defilements, which is a result of conditioning, we see that wisdom helps us to overcome ignorance. Right understanding, right view helps us to overcome the strong attachment to the idea of a permanent separate self. And we see that mindfulness helps us to overcome delusion. And we see that simplicity helps us to overcome craving. And renunciation helps us to overcome self-centered attachment and clinging. And loving kindness and compassion helps us to overcome aversion, ill will, hatred, resentment, jealousy, and so on. Now, the reason why we believe that the self is permanent and separate has to do with not only the use of language, but also the duality that we're conditioned with, the idea that I am separate from the world. And duality begins very early, very innocently, when a child begins to speak. When a child begins to say, I like this, I don't like that. I want this, I don't want that. That's the beginning of duality. And duality means subject and object. And the I is always the subject. And this idea of duality, subject and object, becomes more deep-rooted. It seems more solid in the mind when we begin to identify with our sense experiences. I've spoken about this before. When we begin to say, I am seeing something, I am hearing something, I'm tasting something, I'm smelling something, I'm feeling something by touch, and I'm thinking something. So this duality that's conditioned in the mind becomes more deep-rooted, and it seems more solid. That there's an I at the center of all our experiences. Including I want, I don't want, I like, I don't like. And we begin to feel that I am separate somehow from the world. I'm separate from nature, even separate from society. And we mentioned before is that because we're caught in this duality, and we're caught in thinking, we ask this question, this very old question, the age-old question. What happens to me when I die, and where do I go after death? That question comes because we are caught in this duality. The feeling that I'm permanent and I'm separate from nature, and the world. So that's why we ask that question. So part of the journey of awakening is not only to understand this condition of duality, but to realize that language is what creates this idea of not only duality, but the impression in the mind that I am permanent. Because we need language to communicate, and we need labels. We use the word I, you, he, she, just like we use names. And names are really just social labels, so that we can identify each other more easily. But when we investigate, we begin to see that who we really are not these social labels. Yes, we need them in society, and we need them, on all our documents and so on. But they're not really who we are. And I mentioned before that in North America, where I spend a great deal of time, that there are many people there, they become so attached to their names, they identify so strong with their names, that if you call them by a wrong name, by a mistake, or you forget their name, they get very upset. And some people are even very fussy about the way you pronounce their name. They're that fussy, or they're that deluded. And the reason why this self, the I, feels so permanent is because we are using the same label to communicate. And as you know, if you have to speak a lot in one day, you can use this I many, many times. A few hundred times, I would say. And because we were using the same label I, or the equivalent in other languages, we keep saying I all the time. So it gives the impression in the mind, in consciousness, that this I is rock solid, and everlasting. It is always there. It's very interesting because we may see changes around us, but the I never changes. And that's why it gives the impression that this I is something permanent. But then when we practice mindfulness, we begin to see that it's just a label that we're using quite often, and sometimes a lot. And once we have that understanding and that awareness, we still use the I to communicate, because we have to communicate, but you no longer are so attached to this I. In other words, you no longer take this I so seriously, because you have that understanding and that awareness that this I is just a label that we're using. So we can laugh at ourselves, we can learn to laugh at ourselves. So the problem is not really the I or the self, but it's the strong attachment to it. Taking the I too seriously. Now, delusion, there are many aspects, a few aspects to the nature of delusion. And our main delusion comes from what I've just read. Or a social habit of always reacting. labeling, judging, comparing, criticizing, condemning, liking, not liking, wanting, not wanting, to have aversion, ill will. And initially we don't see that this is the cause of a lot of our conflicts and suffering. We don't see that it is what is creating our illusion. Because when we're always reacting, we create our own mental, emotional reality, right? And we don't see that we're being deluded by this habit of reacting because everyone does it. It seems like a normal social behavior. But when you begin to practice, to bring awareness in your daily life, then you begin to see that. And this is why it took someone like the Buddha to say, stop reacting. When you see, just see. When you hear, just hear. It's a very radical teaching. And at the same time, it's very challenging. Because although it sounds very simple, but it's very difficult to practice. Because it is such a habit that we all have from early childhood, always reacting. And of course, we need labels to communicate. That's obvious. But what happens is that we become so attached to labels that we forget that labels are just labels. And we often mistake the label for the real thing. And we cling to labels as reality. And a lot of the arguments and conflicts that human beings experience, it's really about labels. Just like we become very attached to views and opinions and so on. So when we have more awareness, we begin to awaken from this delusion and how we're conditioned to be deluded. And another aspect of delusion is our mental formations, what the mind is always creating. Because the mind tends to create many stories. Our thoughts and images are creating stories all the time in daily life. And some stories are like mini dramas, some of them are worries or fears. And sometimes you begin to worry that, this might happen or that might happen, and it seems very real. Or whatever fears or anxieties we experience, it seems very real. But when we can apply mindfulness, we begin to see that these fears and worries are just temporary mental states. They are not permanent reality. And as you know, when we're not mindful, these mind-created stories and mini-dramas, worries and fears, they seem so real. so permanent. Especially when there are emotions involved. And similarly, we're also deluded by unpleasant memories. And again, unpleasant memories can seem very solid, very permanent when emotions are involved. And I think part of our mental delusions is created by just, again, our social conditioning. Because we're not brought up to understand the benefits of mindfulness and mindfulness practice. And so we become very attached to thinking itself, to the mind itself. And this is why most of us suffer from neurosis to varying degrees. And neurosis is when we're trapped in thinking and we believe that thinking is reality. And to be intelligent, we have to be thinking all the time. And of course, there are varying degrees of neurosis. Sometimes, a mild neurosis, medium neurosis, and of course, severe neurosis. And I'm sure if you've met a very neurotic person, you can tell. You can see even just the way they look. When you meet a very neurotic person, you can see that they're very tense. Especially in the forehead, this area. They're very tense. And they're trapped in thinking, totally trapped in thinking. And I remember when this mind was also, very trapped, very deluded in thinking. So there was a lot of fear, anxiety, worry, and so on. And of course, when you're trapped in thinking, whenever the mind says I, you think this I is who you are, right? And the eyes again seems very permanent and very separate, separate from the world, separate from society. And so there's a lot of fear, a lot of insecurity. And not only is the mind caught in judging and criticizing, but also a lot of self-judgment, a lot of self-criticism. And so there's a lot of guilt. And I see, especially in Western societies, a lot of people suffer from guilt. But it has to do with the judgmental mind. And this is why it's very important whenever we make mistakes that we have to forgive ourselves for being human. Because as human beings, we are not perfect. And everyone makes mistakes. Everyone. Of course, it is natural to have regrets. We can all relate to that experience. But if we keep regretting and we keep feeling guilty about things we have done, things we have said, then we end up torturing ourselves. And that is not very healthy. And this is why the practice of loving kindness is so beneficial. Because when we do loving kindness meditation, we replace those negative judgmental thoughts with kind, positive thoughts. May I be well, happy, and peaceful. May I be free from fear, conflict, and delusion. May all beings be well, happy, and peaceful. May all beings be free from fear, conflict, and delusion. Because what is interesting is that guilt is an aspect of fear. Why? Because whenever we start feeling guilty, when we're caught in self-blame, we tend to create a negative image of ourselves. You know, I'm so stupid, I'm so crazy, I'm terrible, I'm awful. So having that negative image plus all the other negative judgmental thoughts that keep arising creates fear, creates conflict in the mind. Just like when you're having conflict with somebody, you tend to create a negative image of that person. Whether it's a close friend, a family member, a co-worker, a neighbor, and so on. It's very interesting because if you're having a pleasant relationship with somebody, then we tend to have a pleasant image of that person, don't we? Because it's related to memory. But the moment you have a conflict with someone, we tend to create a negative image of that person. Because again, it's related to memory. And the mind holds on to that conflict with that negative image. So this is why fear and guilt are related. But again, with loving kindness meditation, we can overcome this negativity, the judgmental thoughts, and letting go of that negative image. Now, an important aspect of wisdom, of awakening, is to understand what thinking is. Very important. Because as you know, we're not taught to understand the thinking process. We're only taught subjects. And we have to study. Study in school in order to pass exams. But we're never taught to understand what thinking is. Because you begin to see that thinking is really what is creating most of our mental, emotional suffering and conflicts. We're not taught to understand the benefits of thinking, but also the destructive aspects of thinking. Because it's obvious that we need thinking in daily life, but you find that when we don't need to think, the mind keeps thinking unnecessarily, right? We tend to think too much. And although we need rational, logical thinking, in daily life, thinking easily becomes very irrational, very illogical, when it becomes obsessive, when it becomes negative, as being too judgmental, too critical, and caught in aversion, aversion and ill will. So one of the great revelations I had when I went to India was to discover what thinking was. And thinking, as I've mentioned before, is related to three things in the mind. Memory, past experience, and knowledge. Knowledge, information. Memory, past experience, knowledge, information. And as you can see, it's very simple. It's not rocket science, as they say. And they should be teaching this in high school, at least high school level. And every time we think, we're actually recycling all the information that's in the mind. And thinking has that ability to project in the future. You can see that in your own minds. We're either remembering something or we're projecting in the future. So you can say that thinking is a movement in time. From past to future, past to future. You can see that. And that's why we're conditioned with the idea of time, because of thinking. Whereas when we were very young, we were in a timeless state. I don't know if you can remember that. But I do have clear memories of being that young. And spending most of the childhood outdoors, in nature. Because there was no television, and of course no electronic gadgets. And I remember each day was just timeless. And the wonderful thing about mindfulness, present moment awareness practice, it helps us to bring us back to that state of timelessness. Even for half an hour each day. Because as you know, in daily life and in the working life, time is very important. And schedule. You can say that we're slaves to time. We can't avoid it. But you begin to see that time is actually one of the factors of fear, anxiety, and stress. You can see that. And again, it's very beneficial, even for half an hour each day, usually after work, that you can come back to present moment, mindfulness, and just experience that timelessness, the state of timelessness. It is possible. But you just have to put your smartphone away, even for half an hour. And try to avoid the habit of having to check your messages. Because part of the addiction of checking your phone has to do with anxiety, right? Because when you're anxious, you feel that I have to check the messages. And if I don't check the messages, somehow the world is going to come to an end. Of course, the world is not coming to an end, but it feels that way. That's the nature of anxiety. So at least for half an hour, if you can put your phones away and come to present moment awareness, you can come back to that timeless state. And you can use music if you wish. Anything that's calming, or any chanting that you like. And just come back to that timeless state again. And that state is called being. Just learning how to be. Now, in daily life, we're caught in this movement. It's called becoming. In Dhamma language, we call it becoming. Becoming means, your desire, to do things, to achieve things. And of course, in daily life, if you're working, you cannot avoid that. There are things you have to achieve. And with that strong urge to become, to achieve, to have, and so on, there is usually some anxiety, some fear behind that mental movement. The fear of not becoming, of not achieving. And what is interesting, there's one aspect of becoming that is related to the past. Most of our becoming is related to the future. But the one aspect of becoming that's related to the past is regret, when we're having certain regrets. I should have done that, I should have said that. Or if I'd only thought about this earlier, before, things would be much different now, today. I'm so stupid, why didn't I think of it earlier? That's an aspect of becoming, related to the past. But when we can sit quietly with music, if you wish, or chanting, you can experience just that state of being. And that state of being is freedom from becoming and the fear of not becoming, not achieving, and so on. Just being. So to be or not to be, that is the question. And what is interesting is that when we can appreciate that state of just being, even for half an hour, we're in touch with the timeless dimension of the universe. Because the universe is timeless. And we are a part of the universe. We're not separate from the universe. You can say that we are aspects of the universe in this temporary physical form, being aware of itself. or experiencing itself. We are aspects of the universe experiencing itself. It's a very profound reflection. But when we do it on a regular basis, you begin to see the truth of this. But the mind has to be calm, it has to be still. And then we can experience this timelessness. And in that state of timelessness and calmness, there is no anxiety, no fear, and no stress. Because as you know, when we're very busy, we're very preoccupied, the present moment has very little meaning, right? So one way of dealing with mental delusions, when we're caught in stories, mini dramas, worries and fears, is just to say to yourself, it is only thinking, thinking, thinking. It's only thinking, thinking, thinking. And we come back to present moment awareness. And by doing that, we can get out of the story or the mini drama or the worry and the fear. It helps us to get out of the contents of those thoughts and images. And you realize it's only thinking. So we can awaken from our mental delusion. And similarly, when we are dealing with unpleasant memories, and we all have unpleasant memories, right? And as you know, you can remember something that happened a long time ago, and you can still get upset. Or you can still have regrets, and you can still have guilt. Something that happened a long time ago. And because there are emotions involved, these unpleasant memories, they seem so solid, so permanent. Because of the emotions. So again, when we apply mindfulness, present moment awareness, we begin to see that there are only thoughts and images that are happening in the present moment. And it's very liberating when we realize that. Those images may be related to past events, but the actual experience of those unpleasant memories are really just thoughts and images that are happening now. Only thinking, thinking, thinking. It's very liberating when we realize that, the actual experience of it. It's always in the present moment. And similarly, when we're obsessing too much about the future, again, they are just thoughts and images that are happening in the present moment. And as you know, the future is uncertain. And when we think too much about the future, we naturally experience anxiety, fear. But when we have some mindfulness, then our minds can be more stable. So we can deal with the uncertainties of life. We have more confidence because we have that stability. Because if we don't have mindfulness, naturally, the mind gets anxious and confused. Now, on the journey of awakening, we can reflect on the nature of desire itself, of craving. And desire, the wanting mind, is a part of our human condition. You cannot avoid it. And it starts very early. And those of you who have had children can relate to this experience. When a child, say, around 10 months, 10, 11 months, they're becoming more energetic, more aware of their environment, and they become more mobile. They're learning to walk. And at that age, everything is interesting to a young child. And naturally, the child wants to touch and to play with everything. Now, if a child is playing with something, and you take that thing away from the child, what does a child do? They cry, don't they? Or they want to get something, they want to play with something, and if you prevent them from having it, what does a child do? They cry, don't they? It shows you that this wanting mind is something very natural in the human condition. And when a child is learning language, learning to speak, that child begins to identify with that desire. You know, I want this. Or I must have this. And if I don't get what I want, I'm going to be very unhappy. And if I get what I want, I'm going to be very happy. It's something very natural. And we believe that if I can get what I want, I'm going to be permanently happy. Because a young child does not understand the truth of impermanence. That happiness is only a temporary mental state. And of course, when you're young, you don't understand that when you're feeling unhappy, you don't realize that it's also a temporary mental state. It just feels permanent. I'm going to be upset, I'm going to be miserable for the rest of my life. But fortunately, it changes. So when we reflect on the nature of desire, you begin to see that desire is something very natural in the human condition. But what is really the source of the suffering is when we identify with desire. It's our grasping with desire. I want, I must have, or I don't want. So this is why in Dharma practice we learn how to objectify that state of desire or wanting. Instead of identifying with it, we just see it as there's a state of desire. There's a state of craving or expectation. And it's very different from I want this, or I must have it. You just see desire or craving as desire or craving. And initially, we don't see expectation as a form of desire, a form of craving. But of course, it is when you look at it. When you're expecting something, it's a form of craving, isn't it? And if your expectations are not met, of course, there is dukkha, right? There is suffering, there's conflict. There's disappointment, resentment, sometimes even anger. But initially we don't see it as a form of craving. But when we reflect, you begin to see it. And the quality of the Buddha, of simplicity, is related to the ability to see desire as just desire. And know it is impermanent and it is unsatisfactory and uncertain. And it's uncertain because sometimes when we get what we want, it creates some form of dukkha. This is why there's a very popular saying that goes, be careful what you wish for because you might get it. It might give you more trouble than you expected. Be careful what we wish for because we might get it. Another very wise saying that you rarely hear these days is, the road to hell is often paved with good intentions. Have you heard that saying? The road to hell is often paved with good intentions. It's very true. Because very often people have good intentions, but because they're so anxious, they're too anxious, they end up creating more trouble, more suffering for others, although they have good intentions. And most of the dictators in the last 2 centuries, they all started with good intentions. Think of it. Whether it's Hitler, Mao Zedong, and all the other dictators, they all started with good intentions. But they became very deluded along the way, and they created, so much suffering. Once I was conducting classes at the University of Toronto in Canada. And somebody came to the class. He was not a student, but he happened to live in the downtown area. And he was very angry, very frustrated. So I said to him, "What is your problem?" He says, "I've been involved in environmental issues for several years, trying to save the forests, trying to save the whales, trying to save the environment in general." And he had done a lot of networking with many people who shared the same interest, and they went to conferences in several countries, and they began to realize that most governments are not interested in these environmental issues, in trying, to make the planet a better place. Because most governments are more interested in power, wealth, multinational business, etc., etc. So he became very frustrated and very angry. So I said to him, you have good intentions, but you don't have wisdom. You don't have right understanding. He was very upset. He said, what do you mean by that? I said, yes, you have very good intentions, you have very noble ideas, but you do not know the truth of impermanence and the wisdom of patience. I said, when you come upon obstacles that prevent you from achieving your goals, you have to learn to be patient, to be calm, and to reflect on the truth of impermanence. He says, oh, I've never heard that before. Can you tell me more about this? So I said to him, throughout human history, this scenario has happened many, many times, where you have a good ruler, a good leader, very wise, very sensible, very compassionate, and during their lifetime they were able to do many, many good things for the people. But then they had to die. And guess who takes over? The son. And the son is totally different, from the father. He's ruthless, ambitious, greedy, power hungry, very self-centered. Because, you can imagine being the son of a ruler, they were pampered, spoiled and pampered. So that's where they grew up to be, awful human beings. And these ruthless leaders, they completely destroy all the good deeds of the former ruler, their fathers. This has happened many times. Likewise, a good government. And the new government takes over and they completely do the opposite. So I said to this fellow that even if you're able to achieve many of your objectives in this environmental issue, when you retire or when you die, there are no guarantees what will happen afterwards. No guarantees. That's the truth of impermanence. So yes, you do what you can, but you have to be calm, be patient, and reflect on the truth of impermanence. Now, one of the aspects of awakening is the grasping mind. And this is related to the Buddha's quality of renunciation. Because renunciation is not just becoming a monk or a nun. But the real spirit of renunciation is letting go of this personal grasping, the identification. Because part of our conditioning is to identify with all our experiences, whether it's mental, emotional, or physical. We identify with it. We identify with emotions, feelings, thoughts. And of course, we identify with all our mental formations. My beliefs, my views, my opinions, my ideas. And we identify with the body, right? This is me, this is mine. And what the Dhamma is teaching us is that as human beings, we have this unfortunate habit of identifying with things, because whatever we identify with, whether it's physical, emotional, or mental, it's impermanent. It's subject to change. And therefore we experience dukkha, suffering, conflict, and so on. Now, initially, for example, when a happy feeling arises, naturally we say, I am happy. It seems perfectly normal. Because again, this is our social habit. And when an unhappy feeling arises, we say, I am unhappy. Or I'm upset. Or I'm frustrated. I'm bored, I'm lonely, I'm afraid, and so on. And when we identify with these feelings and emotions, we end up holding on to them as something personal. My happiness or my unhappiness. My frustration, my fear, and so on. And that's why we take things so personally. Now, what is interesting is that initially when we identify with, say, happiness, I am happy, there is no conflict, no dukkha. Simply because it's a pleasant experience, right? But when we say, I am unhappy, or I'm upset, I'm frustrated, I'm angry, there is dukkha. Simply because these are unpleasant mental states. And what is interesting is that when we become too attached to, say, a happy feeling, or certain pleasures or enjoyment, eventually we experience frustration. Why? Simply because it's impermanent. It changes. Because anything that feels good, we want it to be permanent. Anything that's unpleasant or painful, we want it to go away as quick as possible, right? And what is interesting is that if you've had a very wonderful experience, very enjoyable, very pleasant, although we can't hold on to it, although we would like to, but the mind holds on to it as memory, right? And when we remember that pleasure, that enjoyment, then naturally the mind wants to repeat that experience because it feels good. we want to repeat it. And that's one of the aspects of craving. We remember something very pleasurable, very enjoyable, and naturally we want to repeat it. Whereas if we experience something unpleasant or painful, whether it's physical pain or emotional pain, the opposite happens. We don't want to repeat it, right? Hence the fear of pain. That's one of the fears we have, the fear of pain. Physical pain or emotional pain. So one of the great benefits in mindfulness, it gives us the ability to objectify these feelings, moods, and emotions. It has that ability. So instead of saying, I am upset, or I'm afraid, or I'm frustrated, we can say, there is upset, or there's a state of upset. There's a state of frustration, there's a state of fear. Not I am afraid or I am frustrated. You just see it as it is. And we remind ourselves, it is impermanent. This too shall pass. It's just a temporary mental state. So that's a very good way of dealing, say, with fear. To know that it's only a temporary mental state. Although it feels very real, but when you apply mindfulness, we can see that it's only a temporary mental state, a changing condition of the mind. And that's one of the great benefits of mindfulness. And an aspect of awakening is also to reflect on the body, the physical body, and realize that it really doesn't belong to us. It's not me, it's not mine. It belongs to the changing conditions of nature. For example, if you tell the body not to get sick, does the body listen to us? It doesn't, right? The body will get sick because of certain conditions. Just like if you tell the body not to get tired, not to feel hungry, and so on, the body does these things because it follows its own natural laws. So when we reflect on the physical body, we can see that the body belongs to the changing conditions of nature. It is anatta. It is not self. Not self. Of course, we have to take care of the body as much as we can, but we cannot get too attached to it. It's just a temporary physical condition, and is composed of the elements: earth, water, heat, air, space, and consciousness. And the elements go back to nature. So if you really want to know what continues after death, it's really the elements. There is no I, no self, no me that continues. And we mentioned earlier that when we apply mindfulness, present moment awareness, we begin to see the truth of process. We see physical and mental process. Rupa and nama. For example, the physical sensation of the breath, That is the body. And the awareness of the breathing sensation is mind. Nama. The physical sensation of the breath is the body, and the awareness of the breathing sensation is mind. So you see Rupa and Nama, mind and body, physical and mental process. You begin to see the truth of this. And we're alive because we're a process. It's a very complex process, but it's still a process. And because it's a process, or we're a process, we have to keep recharging this process. In the same way that we recharge your cell phones. It's the same thing. So when there's a death, we normally say somebody has died or somebody has passed away. Because this is our social language, our social convention. Somebody has died, somebody has passed away. But at a deeper level, it's this process, and the body and mind, the physical and mental process simply shuts down. It stops working. That is the deeper reality of this process, body and mind. Because usually, because we're caught in our conditioning, we think that a self exists. And we think that a self, there's a center, an I that sees, hears, tastes, smells, feels, and thinks. And we believe that other selves exist, and other self dies. But from a Dhamma perspective, this is incorrect understanding. Because what we see as a self or a person is this process of body and mind, constant change. And the senses are sensing by themselves. Seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, and thinking. It's very profound. And this was one of the insights of the Buddha. He realized there is no I, no me, who's actually seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, and thinking. It's all happening by themselves. And if you were not here for the last two or three talks, I demonstrated this fact. For example, just close your eyes for a moment. Just close your eyes. Now open your eyes. And you see that seeing arises automatically, doesn't it? You can do this experiment at home if you're not really sure. Just close your eyes and open your eyes, and you see that seeing arises automatically. You don't have to make a special effort to see. It just happens as long as your eyes are healthy. It just happens. Just like hearing, right? You don't have to make a special effort to hear the speaker. There's only hearing. Just like when you eat, tasting arises automatically. And if you're not too sure about this, when you go home this evening, if you drink something or you eat something, just say to yourself, I'm going to eat this thing or I'm going to drink this thing and I'm going to try not to taste this. See what happens. I'm going to try not to taste this. Because whether you like it or not, tasting will arise. All right? As long as you have taste buds on your tongue, tasting happens. Tasting consciousness arises. There is no taster who is tasting the food. And again, this was one of the insights of the Buddha. It's very profound, but once you see it, it is very clear. And the same with thinking. Normally we say, I am thinking something, right? I'm thinking good thoughts or I'm thinking bad thoughts or negative thoughts. So we believe that there's a thinker separate from thoughts. That there's a thinker, there's an I thinking thoughts. So the I feels separate. Again, that feeling of separation is a result of this duality we spoke about earlier. The duality of subject and object that we're conditioned with. But in truth, there's no thinker separate from thoughts. The thinker, the I, is a part of thinking. And we did this experiment previously. Just close your eyes for a moment and just think these three thoughts slowly. I am thinking. I am thinking. I am thinking. You see that I is a thought, am is a thought, thinking is a thought. So I am thinking are three thoughts. Do you see that? I am thinking. There are three thoughts there. In other words, the I is not separate as a thinker. Do you see what I'm pointing to? Yeah. If you're not sure, practice this at home. You see the truth of it. It's very profound, but you just have to practice. I am thinking. It's only thinking. I is a thought. And this is what we call vipassana, the insight when we see constant change as process. We begin to see this I is just a thought, it's just a label. It's not permanent. There is just process. Physical, mental, emotional process. There is also delusion on a mass scale. Think of a football match, a soccer match, like World Cup soccer, where thousands of people are watching a match. Now, if your team is winning, how do you feel? But if your team is losing, how do you feel? That's delusion on a mass scale. And we tend to forget that it's just people kicking a ball from one end of the field to another. We tend to forget that it's just a game. That is delusion on a mass scale. And of course, during World Cup soccer, there are people who are betting not only thousands of dollars, but millions of dollars. And when people are betting big money, it's no longer a game, right? That is delusion on a mass scale. I'd like to share an experience with you. I just remembered it. I used to be an avid tennis player during my college days. And usually when, you had those tournaments, like Wimbledon Open, Australian Open, French Open, I always used to watch these tournaments. So one day my brother and I were watching the Wimbledon from UK. And this was the men's final. We had to watch it. Now, it just so happened that one of the players had already won 2 or 3 times. And the other player was his first time in the final. So he was the underdog, as we say. So I was rooting for him. I wanted him to win, at least once. But because it was the first time in the Wimbledon final, he was very nervous, you can imagine. And he kept making a lot of mistakes, what we call unforced errors, because he was so nervous. And he was suffering, and I was suffering with him. And I wasn't enjoying the match one bit. And I just happened to look above the TV, my brother's TV, and there was a window. That window saved my life. I looked out the window and I realized it was a beautiful day. Vast blue sky and beautiful white cotton clouds. And I suddenly had this awakening. It's a beautiful day, and here I am inside watching this match on television, broadcast from the UK, and I'm suffering. I just had that awakening. And I got up and I left the house. And my brother was in shock because he's a real sports addict. He'll watch any sport. He couldn't believe that I was actually leaving the Wimbledon final. And I walked to the park in about 10-15 minutes. And I sat under a tree, looked at the flowers, the trees, the clouds, and the vast clear sky. And I understood what Nibbana was about. Because I was experiencing dukkha watching that match. And then because I was able to let it go, I experienced Nibbana, a state of no dukkha. Understand? Simply because I was able to let it go. Interestingly, a few hours later, when I went back to my brother's house, he told me that player, who was making all the mistakes, the underdog, he actually came back and he won the tournament. And I missed it. Now, I was very happy for him. But by that time, I was no longer interested in the game. There was no longer that strong attachment to the game. Because to me, being at the park and being in a peaceful state with all that natural beauty, it was more important than the tennis match. Okay, so at this time, are there any questions? Any questions? I'd just like to do a reading here. As we start to practice awareness, we soon discover how much of our lives we spend dreaming. Normally, we have no problems noticing our night dreams, or those vivid excursions into fantasy that we call daydreams. What we usually don't notice is that we're dreaming most of the time, caught up in the movies of our mind. These mini dreams or mini dramas may only last 10 or 20 seconds. Our mind is constantly imagining reality and substituting that imagination for direct perception. The practice of mindfulness helps us distinguish between thoughts and awareness, between thinking and being. Thoughts, images, and moods are not necessarily connected with reality, with what is actually happening in the present moment. For example, there's a big difference in thinking and actually believing that life is awful, life is terrible, and having the awareness that we're only having thoughts that life is awful, life is terrible. I'll repeat that. There's a big difference in thinking and actually believing that life is awful, life is terrible, and having the awareness that we are only having thoughts that life is awful, life is terrible. Only thinking. Through paying closer attention to our experience, we begin to make a subtle yet crucial distinction between our shifting judgments, ideas, views, and opinions about reality and the vivid, ineffable qualities of immediate experience itself. Only awareness can free us from our thoughts, from our mental, emotional world. In the moment we become aware that thoughts are just thoughts, feelings are just feelings, emotions are just emotions, rather than reality itself, we wake up from their spell and can return to presence. It is empowering to discover that we are not enslaved by our thoughts, by how our mind interprets reality. This sudden taste of awakening, of freedom, provides a glimpse of ordinary magic. It takes practice to wake up, to emerge from our mind-created worlds. Thoughts, images, and moods are not necessarily connected to what is actually happening in the present moment. That is why the Buddha taught us to be mindful of them before we are influenced or caught by them. The thinking process is a response to memory, past experience, and knowledge, information, and it projects itself into the future. So thinking is a movement in time, from past to future, past to future. Thinking is limited, mechanical, overreactive, and leads to confusion and delusion. Thinking produces fear, worry, anxiety, craving, greed, envy, jealousy, resentment, feelings of loneliness and isolation, and other emotions and moods. Thinking is also time as past and future. The self or ego, the idea of I, me, and mine, is a product of the thinking process, as a collection of memories. Awareness is always in the present moment. It is clear, unlimited, and intelligent. It is the Buddha nature, the one who knows. one who's awake, calm, and alert. Living in the present moment, we need constant awareness, attention. In this way, we can check the restless, agitated, worrisome, and obsessive mind. We can feel peaceful, balanced, and secure, and less self-centered. Our attachments and cravings become less and less, and our minds become more light and free. I mentioned that there is a reason why we believe, or we tend to believe, in spirits. And it has to do with the mystery of death and the unknown. Because death has always been a great mystery, hasn't it? And the unknown. And we're not sure, we don't know what really happens after death. And this is why we ask the question, what happens to me when I die? Where do we go after death? And because we don't have the understanding of process, of the body-mind process, and the 5 aggregates, the 5 factors that create our daily experience, we think that somehow the person that we knew and loved, they have become an invisible being. And they are now living in the spirit world, the invisible world. Because it has to do with that, the mystery of death and the unknown and the human imagination. But of course, if you want to feel some connection with your ancestors, then it's a good practice to do offerings. If you feel some connection. And I mentioned before, there's a reason why we burn a lot of incense, especially during Hungry Ghost Month. You know, the tall, giant incense. Because we know that the spirits in quotation marks, cannot consume the physical offerings. Whether it's food or drink and so on. But we believe that the essence of the offerings, the essence, the nutrition of the food is being carried by the incense smoke into the spirit world. So the spirits can consume the offerings. Personally, I do not believe in spirits, but I find it very interesting, this belief, from a cultural aspect. It's very interesting. And one of the great difficulty is the unknown. And out of this unknown, we would like to continue somehow after death. Because our conditioned mind, or thinking mind, is based on memories, as we said, and knowledge, information. And so it has a lot of attachments regarding memories and past experiences. And we don't want to let go of our attachments. So this is one of the reasons why we want to continue somehow after death. And this is why humans have created many beliefs in an afterlife. And I mentioned before that the belief in reincarnation or rebirth is only one belief. There are many. There are many, many beliefs. But it's simply because our conditioned mind, the thinking mind, is afraid to come to an end and is afraid to let go of all our attachments. And our thinking mind cannot relate to the unknown. So naturally there's fear. Fear of the unknown. Because our thinking mind can only relate to that which we know. Right? Memory, knowledge, information. Right? So it cannot relate to the unknown. And I like to use the example of, say, a fish. A fish cannot relate to the experience of riding a bicycle, right? And a fish cannot relate to the experience of driving a car or using internet. So in the same way, our thinking mind, our conditioned mind, cannot relate to the unknown. It can only relate to that which it knows. Memory, knowledge, information, and of course, attachments, all the attachments we have. So it cannot relate. So there's fear. And what thinking does, because it is the nature of thinking to project itself in the future, right, from the past. Right? We can all relate to that. Because it's always moving from past to future, regardless of what language you're thinking in. So what thinking does, it projects itself beyond death. I wonder if you see that. And thinking says, of course, I will continue after death. Hence, our beliefs in an afterlife will continue somehow. But it's just a belief. You can say it is a wishful thinking. And I mentioned before, if you speak to a Christian will tell you, I'm not afraid of death. Because I will have eternal life after death. It's one of their beliefs. I'll be, with God, or I'll be with Jesus. So it's very comforting, right? It's very comforting when we have this belief. Or if you speak to a Hindu will tell you, I'm not afraid of death. It's like taking off an old jacket and putting on a new jacket. The belief in reincarnation is very comforting. But what is very interesting and insightful is that in meditation practice, when we allow the mind to become silent, when we allow thinking to stop by itself, in that silence, that stillness is the unknown. That silence, that stillness in meditation is the state of the unknown, meaning the absence of thinking, the absence of thought. When you allow thinking to become quiet, to stop by itself, that state of silence is the unknown. And when we experience this and we understand it, there is no longer the fear of the unknown. Because we experience the unknown in that silence as something very peaceful and timeless. Very peaceful, very and timeless. It's very profound, but it is possible. Just like even when you just feel some calmness, there is less anxiety, less fear, less stress. And less confusion. Because it is thinking that creates confusion, fear, anxiety, and time. And so that question, what happens to me when I die and where do I go after that, that question does not arise. But as long as we're caught in thinking and the conditioning of duality, that I'm separate somehow, and separate from the world, I'm separate from nature, we will be asking that question. We don't have time to go into the elements, but it's on YouTube. I'll give you the link. Because we're composed of elements, and we go back to the elements, and we go back to nature. But initially, when we first hear that we're composed of elements, it's just an idea. It's just a concept. But when we reflect on the elements, different parts of the body, you begin to see the truth of it. And we're alive, we exist because of these elements. They're a reality. And of course, we must remember that we're 70% water. 70%. And then we have the earth element, heat, the air element, we have the element of space, and we have the element of consciousness. It's a reality. And when we reflect on these elements on a more regular basis, you get to a stage that we're just a collection of elements pretending to be people. We're elements pretending to be people. And this collection of elements sitting here is pretending to be Bhante Kovida from Canada. And your collection of elements is pretending to be who you think you are. But in the end, it's all pretending. And when the body-mind process shuts down, when it stops working, the elements go back to nature. They all go back to nature. So we came out of the energy, the elements of the planet, the solar system, and we return to the elements of nature. So these profound reflections are related to the profound teaching of anatta, no permanent separate self. No permanent separate self. So if you have any personal questions, you can come and see me afterwards. So may you all be well, peaceful, and happy. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.